You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Season 2, Episode 8, written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. Thus in you I shall put my trust, yet being vigilant from day to day as we travel here and yon of folks we meet along the way. The trio was near exhaustion when they reached the western shore of Kichigami. Bearclaw grabbed his bundle and headed up a path without looking back. Seamus and Bright Moon dragged the canoe out of the reach of the lapping waves and hurried to catch up so they wouldn't get lost. As they neared the edge of the encampment, Bearclaw cupped his hands around his mouth and began calling out Waving Grass's name to the four winds. They waited for a few minutes before Bearclaw looked at them, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "I guess she's gone," as though the fact were unimportant. He turned and went into the lodge with his traveling gear. Seamus felt a twinge of worry over the man. Between the minor theft of the map and his flippant attitude over the absence of Waving Grass, he wondered if joining him had been the best choice. "Well, aren't you going after her?" Seamus asked as the hide covering dropped over the door. "In time," came the muted answer. "Right now I'm tired." Seamus looked into the worried eyes of his bride and whispered, "What kind of a man is he? Doesn't he care?" "Do not forget the shaman's words," she said. "He is not to be trusted." As their eyes met again, she added, "He is right, though. It was a hard trip, and when one is weary, one does foolish things. Indian women often go into the forest alone to gather roots and berries or sticks for the fire. That may be so, but I think I may worry for as long as we are with this man. We know so little about him. What if he attacked you?" "I am with you, husband. As long as you are near, I will be safe." "That's very reassuring, but I don't know how safe it will keep us from him. If the shaman said not to trust him, we should keep an eye on him. Perhaps we should return to your village straight away." "Let us wait a while," she said. He reluctantly picked up their belongings, and they entered the lodge. Bearclaw was lying on a raised platform, arranging a hide robe over himself to ward off the nip in the air. "I'll be more up to searching for her after I've slept a while. You should rest too," he said matter-of-factly. When he put it that way, it sounded logical to Seamus, and he wondered why he was having nagging doubts about Bearclaw's character. He looked around the one-room lodge and sensed that nothing was amiss. Everything seemed to be tidy enough, except that the cedar boughs on the floor were dried out and brittle. They should have been replaced with fresh ones long ago. Perhaps, he thought, Waving Grass was not familiar with the custom. Didn't Bearclaw say she was Blackfoot? Maybe they don't use cedar boughs to keep the bugs out and soften the step. Seamus looked up from his musings over the floor coverings to find Bright Moon examining the cooking utensils. Her eyes darted along the raised shelf where she found some pemmican. She took down the skin bag and scooped some of the contents into a clay pot. He watched as she added water until it was the right consistency. Bearclaw, with one side of his nose nearly sealed shut from the scar, snored wheezily on the platform. It reminded Seamus of the metallic zing-chaw of a cross-cut saw. He looked over at his new partner and marveled at how a person could fall asleep so quickly. What was it that Father O'Connor used to say, innocent as a... Bright Moon interrupted his thoughts as she asked, "Do you want it cold or heated up?" "I think warm," he said. "I'll get some faggots for the fire." He stepped out into the sunlight and picked up an armload of the twigs he had seen stacked by the door. As he raised up, he saw a woman coming out of the forest dragging a sled loaded with more of the same. "Bright Moon," he said through the door, "come here. I think Bearclaw's missing woman has just reappeared." She stepped out and followed his line of sight. Together they waited until the woman entered the clearing. When she saw them, she stopped and stared. "It's all right," Bright Moon said in Chippewa. To add reassurance, she indicated the hide door and said, "Bearclaw is here, too." "Bearclaw?" the other woman said almost inaudibly. Seamus indicated the lodge door with a nod of his head. "Bearclaw, he came back?" the woman said louder as she dropped the rope and ran past them and disappeared into the lodge. Seamus put his arm around his wife's shoulders and squeezed her to him. "I don't think she expected him to return, but I think she missed him. He has been gone long. About 4 months by his reckoning. I wouldn't care to be away from you that long," he said. She smiled at him as they entered the lodge. Waving Grass sat on the platform, stroking Bearclaw's shaggy, sleeping head. He had shifted so that the snoring had stopped, but he had not awakened at her touch. Waving Grass smiled at them and said, "I was afraid that he would not come back." Bright Moon approached her and said, "He has. The two women began to chatter quietly in Chippewa, and Seamus bent over the fire pit. He knelt beside the dry killing and began turning a stick with a string bow the way his wife's people had taught him. Soon there was a curl of smoke where he had bored into the split log. They began to settle into a routine as the colder weather approached. Seamus learned the trapper's ways quickly as he and Bear Claw set out traps for the winter. They worked together until Seamus knew how to build a snare that would hold for 3 or 4 days it took to make the rounds checking them. Then they went in opposite directions, thinking they could trap twice as many animals before spring. They would have many pelts and become wealthy men. That was a foreign thought to Seamus, as he had never known much more than poverty, though to him it was not poverty but normal. Each time they met back at the main encampment, the men noticed that their wives' bellies were growing. They would both be fathers about the same time in the spring. Seamus's excitement grew each time he came back from his rounds. He could not understand why, instead, Bear Claw was becoming morose. He should be pleased and proud. The women worked well together, each bringing new methods to the partnership. Even though she had been there for nearly a year, Waving Grass marveled at the wildlife and plants that she had not known in the western country. Bright Moon taught her how to find the roots she did not know existed. The best part was being able to talk woman to woman, for there were things that were not to be discussed with men. The winter passed quickly and pleasantly for the foursome. The stash of pelts grew to such proportion that they chose to stop trapping. Otherwise they would not be able to transport them. Instead, they set to building another canoe like the one they had beached on the banks of the Kichigami. They would need the space. Seamus had suggested a coracle to tow along behind, full of pelts. After he had described it to Bear Claw, though, they determined it wouldn't hold the weight, but would probably sink, taking a full winter's work to the bottom of the Kichigami. The women contributed suggestions on the construction according to the customs of their people, and in the end they had a serviceable canoe that would hold the weight of half the pelts and 2 people. As the spring thaw arrived, so did the babies. Within a week of each other they came squalling into the world. Waving Grass had told Bright Moon of her ordeal the first time, caused by the frigid waters, but neither woman thought it would be a problem. However, within 2 weeks Waving Grass was suffering from chills as she had before. Soon she slipped into a deep coma from which she did not recover. Bear Claw was in the forest when Waving Grass died. He wasn't expected back for a few days, so Seamus and Bright Moon saw to her sad, lonely burial. Bright Moon took over the feeding and caring of Bear Claw's son. When Bear Claw returned, he barely acknowledged Waving Grass's departure and began to act as though the child never existed. Seamus became quite alarmed at his cavalier attitude. He wondered how a man could not want to hold his own son and watch him grow. Bear Claw would stay out in the forest for many days at a stretch under the guise of scouting for next winter's trapping locations. One day in April, Seamus came back from a short hunting expedition to hear Bright Moon screaming. He dropped his kill and ran to the lodge to find Bear Claw trying to force himself on her. He grabbed Bear Claw by the shoulder, spun him around, and drove his fist into the side of the man's face as he was spinning. Bear Claw stumbled and fell across the edge of the platform, knocking himself unconscious. Seamus embraced his bride protectively. "I told you I would be safe with you near," she said with a sob as she looked into his eyes with adoration. "What if I had not come back in time? I knew you would. The shaman told me this too." "Is there nothing the shaman hasn't foreseen?" Seamus said in frustration. "Not much," she said with a little hiccup. "He told me that now he will go," she added, nodding toward the unconscious figure on the floor. "He will take his share of the furs and leave." Bear Claw chose that moment to return to awareness. "Yeah, I'll take my share and leave right now." He staggered to his feet, picked up his few belongings, and stumbled out of the lodge, not taking the time to apologize for his behavior. They watched him from the lodge as he loaded his things into one of the canoes, and their eyes followed him back and forth as he took half the pelts to the shore, loaded up, and shoved off. "What about your son?" yelled Seamus as the canoe slid away from the bank. "You can have him," he replied, and added, "Never wanted the little whelp anyway." They stood on the shore, arm in arm, in stunned silence, and watched him paddle away. "Father O'Connor would say that he was a particularly ugly man, inside and out," Seamus said as they turned back toward the lodge. "It is as though my shaman and your Father O'Connor were the same person," Bright Moon said. She put her arm around her husband's waist as they walked. "Maybe they were," he mused. They entered the lodge as the boys were stirring awake. "Poor Waving Grass," she said. Yes, to have died before she knew her son. That too. But to be betrayed by her husband. It was his duty out of love for her to take care of their son, and she couldn't trust him to do that. She thought for a moment before adding, "She didn't get the chance to name him." "We will name him something that will honor her memory." "You're a good man, husband," she said with her eye smile. She had lifted the lad who was making the most noise and begun nursing him. Of course it was Bear Claw's son who was the most demanding. She would have to stop thinking of him as Bear Claw's son and instead consider him always as Waving Grass's boy. She wondered how Waving Grass could ever have gotten mixed up with that reprobate. She certainly was never like that herself, but every time Bright Moon had brought up the subject, Waving Grass had found a way to change it without being insulting. Bright Moon would never know what to tell the boy about his parents. Perhaps if they raised him as a twin to their own son, the question would never come up and the past would stay hidden. It would be too much of a burden for the boy to grow up knowing that his father didn't want him. As he fell asleep, her own son roused completely and demanded feeding. As she switched babies, she told her thoughts to Seamus to get his opinion. He pondered for a while and then asked, "You don't think it would be too much of a burden to raise both?" He nodded at her swollen breast where his red-headed son was busily taking in life. "I can do this if you are willing to help me." "Of course I'll be helping you. My name isn't Bear Claw." She smiled at the jab at his recently departed partner. "Speaking of whom, I think we will give him a day's head start before we begin the trip back to Fort Dearborn. We'll leave early tomorrow morning." "As you wish, husband," she said. "The boys won't remember this first canoe trip, but it would be good to be away from these bad memories." Seamus awoke with the robins before the sun had put in an appearance. He dressed quietly and slipped out to load the bales of furs into the canoe. When he opened the shed where they were stored, he discovered that most of the remaining bales had been removed. Bear Claw, he thought. He must have come back during the night and taken as many as he could put in his canoe without it floundering. He stormed back to the lodge and found Bright Moon making him a meal. "He took most of the pelts," he said. "It will be all right, husband. He is gone, and we will make do as best we can." "Aye, that's the truth of it, my love." Whatever had made Seamus think he could become a wealthy man? Of course someone would have to come along and smack him back down where he belonged. To him, wealth seemed to be the privilege of the stingy and mean-spirited people of the world anyway. Bright Moon wouldn't understand the use of money, so what was the point? He loved her so much that it almost hurt sometimes. That would be his reward in life. Bright Moon gently stroked her son's red locks as she cooed to him. Seamus realized that no one would take that from him, and that he was the luckiest Irishman in the world. He went out to collect the rabbit that he had dropped the day before when Bright Moon had screamed and found that it too was gone. Why wouldn't it be, he mused. It was a free meal left lying around. He went to the shed, collected the remaining pelts, and put them into the canoe. At least they had something to show for the hard winter's work, meager though it was. When he got back to the lodge, he saw that Bright Moon had packed everything she thought they could use into a couple of parfletches she had found under the platform. After he ate, she cradled the boys one in each arm and nodded to Seamus to take the parfletches. They set off for the shore and settled into the canoe with her and the babies in the front to give them the smoother ride. Seamus and the load took back of center. It promised to be a more arduous trip with Seamus doing all the paddling, but they were in no hurry, and if they tired, they could rest on the shore. The memories of that place would forever be bittersweet, but they would have to become part of the past. They had the boys and the future to think about, and little else mattered. As he paddled east along the southern coast of Kichigami, Seamus realized how different everything looked in the spring than on their trip there in the fall. He spoke his thoughts to Bright Moon. "It will be all right, husband. We will find our way." She paused and thought, "Or another way." "You are so philosophical," he said. She thought about that for a moment before she asked, "What does this philosophical mean, husband?" He laid the paddle across the canoe and rested his arms over it as he thought about the best way to phrase his answer. "In your case, love of my life, it would mean acceptance of the things that you cannot change. Instead of becoming upset, you simply nod and move on." I like that word, philosophical. Yes, that is a good word. People in New York call the natives of this land savage. I have to say that nothing I have seen makes me think that is even close to the right description. In fact, some of the rowdies of New York were far more savage than your people. Thank you, husband. But you should know that there are certain of my people who can be very savage. This Black Hawk is one of those people. I heard about him when we were still in your village. What is his problem? He is not very philosophical, husband. He cannot accept that the white man is coming here to stay. He is a very selfish man and doesn't think that we should share the land with your people. It is not his land. It has been lent to us by the man above, no more. See, that is what I mean when I say that you are very philosophical, he said. He thought for another moment and then added, I knew a man back in Ireland who was so much the opposite of that it cost him his life. They coasted nearly to a stop as they mused over the mysteries of life and death. "How'd that happen, husband?" "I took it," he said, and looked down at his hands as though they were the culprits. She waited, and he finally looked up to see concern on her face over the tear in the corner of his eye. "It's a sad story," he began, and he told her the tale of his priest, his first love, the death of Mayfair, and his departure from the only home he had never known. During the telling, he had begun to casually paddle again, and when the tale was over and he returned his awareness to their surroundings, he realized that he had turned into the correct river back toward Fort Dearborn. "You are a marvel, my love," he said to Bright Moon. "Why do you say that, husband?" "You said we will find our way, or another, and it distracted me long enough for us to do just that. This is the river we want." She looked around at their surroundings and smiled. "It does seem right, doesn't it? Aye, and you are still a marvel. Have I told you recently that I love you? With your eyes and your smile, often." At that moment the boys awoke, and the spell was broken by reality. They would need feeding, and he would need to concentrate more energy paddling against the current.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.